The little corporal, a big misunderstanding. Napoleon, you know the name. He was that French guy, the one with the very big hat. And of course he was always portrayed as being incredibly angry. But more than anything he was short, right? Exceptionally, remarkably, almost comically short. That's the picture everyone seems to have firmly lodged in their brains. It's practically a historical law at this point, isn't it? The tiny general with a massive ego. But what if I were to tell you something truly shocking? What if I said that this entire image, this fundamental belief you hold about Napoleon's supposed vertical challenge is, well, how do I put this delicately? A steaming pile of old French misconceptions. Yes, you heard me. It's largely nonsense, a historical fib that's been passed down through generations like a slightly embarrassing family heirloom. So, prepare yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, because we are about to embark on a fascinating journey. Okay, let's get straight to the nitty-gritty, the actual numbers. Because numbers, unlike those rather creative British cartoonists from the 19th century, don't usually have an agenda to push. Or do they, when they're measured in different units? At the time of his death in 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte was indeed measured. The official result, recorded by his physician Francesco Antomarchi, was 5 feet, 2 inches. Aha, you might triumphantly cry, "See, short, but please hold your tiny metaphorical horses for just a moment." Those were, crucially, French inches. Yes, you heard that right, French inches. A pre-metric French inch or paus was approximately 2.71 centimeters long. Now compare that to a British imperial inch, which measures a slightly more modest 2.54 centimeters. So when we take Napoleon's recorded height of 5 feet 2 inches in those longer French units and do the maths, converting it into the British or American system we're more familiar with, something rather interesting happens. His height translates to roughly 5 feet 6.5 inches, or even pushing 5 feet 7 inches. Now that's hardly the stature of a towering basketball player, granted. But for his era, the early 19th century, that was perfectly average, if not slightly above average for a Frenchman. The myth of his shortness, therefore, starts to crumble when you simply look at the measuring stick, that is. So, if Napoleon wasn't actually auditioning to be one of Snow White's 7 companions, why on earth does this myth persist with such stubborn tenacity? For the answer to that, we must turn our gaze across the English Channel. Enter the British. Oh, the British. You have to admire their commitment to a good bit of wartime slander. They really knew how to hold a grudge, and more importantly, how to weaponize a caricature. During the long and bitter Napoleonic Wars, Great Britain and France weren't exactly exchanging pleasantries or holiday cards. They were locked in a desperate struggle for dominance, a true clash of titans. And what is one of the most effective, time-honored tools in any wartime arsenal? Propaganda, my friends. The British press in particular excelled at this dark art, aiming to diminish their formidable foe in every way possible. British cartoonists of the era, figures like the incredibly influential and bitingly satirical James Gilray, had an absolute field day with Napoleon's image. They gleefully and relentlessly depicted him as Little Boney. He was portrayed as a comically small, petulant child, often throwing tantrums, being easily outwitted, or dwarfed by towering, heroic British figures like John Bull, or even by everyday objects. These images were incredibly powerful. There was another, perhaps more subtle factor that likely contributed to this widespread perception of Napoleon as being vertically challenged. This factor was, ironically, of his own making, his personal bodyguards, the elite soldiers of his imperial guard. These men were not just any soldiers, they were the absolute cream of the crop, the best of the best, handpicked for their loyalty, bravery, and significantly, their physical presence. They were, in short, very big blokes. To even be considered for a place in Napoleon's imperial guard, especially the grenadiers or chasseurs applied who were often closest to him, there were strict height requirements. These soldiers were deliberately chosen for their imposing stature, often needing to be well over the average height of the time. So, try to picture this common scene. Napoleon, a man of what we now know to be average height for his time, constantly surrounded by these veritable human redwoods. Section 5. The Napoleon Complex, a modern myth with old roots. This historical misrepresentation, this shrinking of a historical giant, has had some rather peculiar and lasting cultural ripple effects. Perhaps the most famous or infamous of these is the term Napoleon Complex. It's the theory suggesting that some men of shorter stature exhibit overly aggressive, boastful, or domineering behavior. This behavior is supposedly a way to compensate for their perceived lack of physical height, a sort of "I may be small but I'll show them I'm mighty" attitude, apparently fueled by a deficiency in inches. But here's the delicious irony, the real kicker in this whole affair. If Napoleon Bonaparte wasn't actually short by the standards of his time, then the entire premise of the Napoleon Complex, at least as it directly relates to him and his supposed motivations, is built upon a complete falsehood. It's a psychological complex named in honor of a historical figure who didn't even possess the characteristic it purports to explain. And yet, the term Napoleon Complex persists stubbornly in our vocabulary. A modern myth with very old and very inaccurate roots. It stands as a testament to the enduring power of a good story, even if that story is, to put it mildly, historically challenged. Section 6. Little lies, big impact, when misinformation rewrites history. Now at this point you might be sitting there thinking, okay John, this is all mildly interesting, it's a quirky bit of historical trivia about a long-dead French emperor's actual height versus his reputed height. But really, who cares? Does it actually matter in the grand scheme of things? And that's a perfectly fair question to ask. But here's the thing, it matters. Because the enduring story of Napoleon's supposed shortness is a perfect, almost comically clear, and easily digestible example of how misinformation can take root in the public consciousness. Section 7. Why size mismatters the enduring legacy of a tall tale. So, to recap Napoleon Bonaparte, he was the Emperor of the French. He was an undeniable military genius, for better or worse. And as it now turns out, much to the chagrin of pub quiz setters everywhere, he was a man of perfectly average height for his particular time and place. He was not the miniature menace, the pocket-sized dictator that popular imagination and British wartime humor so vividly painted him to be. That image is quite simply wrong. The pervasive myth of Little Napoleon was in reality a potent and carefully constructed cocktail. It was one part differing international measurement systems creating initial confusion. It was another, very large part relentless and highly effective wartime propaganda designed to belittle an enemy. And it was finished with a dash of the visual trickery that comes from constantly being surrounded by exceptionally tall bodyguards. Section 8. Debunking the diminutive, setting the record straight. Let's really hammer this point home, shall we? Because it seems to take a lot to dislodge a myth this well entrenched. The man, Napoleon Bonaparte, was not, I repeat, a hobbit with a penchant for bicorn hats and military conquest. The primary historical source, the document closest to the actual event, is his autopsy report. This report, conducted by Dr. Francesco Antomarchi, stated his height quite clearly, 5 pieds 2 pouces 3 lignes, that's Old French for 5 feet 2 inches 3 lines. Now if you take those French measurements and convert them using the pied du roi, king's foot system, which was the standard in France before the metric system fully took hold, you get a different picture. In that system, 1 pouce, French inch, was equivalent to 2.707 centimeters. Do the calculation, 62 French inches asterisk, 2.707 cm French inch, =, 167.834 centimeters. That converts to approximately 1.686 meters, which is roughly 5 feet 6.39 inches. Let's be generous and call it 5 feet 6.5 inches. Now consider the average height for adult Frenchmen in the early 19th century. Historical data suggests it hovered somewhere around 5 feet 5 inches, approximately 165 centimeters. So, far from being short, Napoleon was actually slightly than the average man of his country and his time. Section 9. Beyond the battlefield. The truth about Napoleon's stature. The remarkable persistence of this particular myth, the idea of a diminutive Napoleon, arguably tells us far more about ourselves and our human tendencies than it actually does about the French emperor himself. It clearly shows our collective love for a simple, easily digestible narrative. A man of immense power, a figure who reshaped a continent, but also, that's a story with inherent appeal, a story with legs, even if the subject of the story supposedly didn't have particularly long ones. It also serves as a stark and enduring illustration of the sheer effectiveness of well-crafted propaganda. The British, facing a formidable and dangerous enemy, needed to diminish him, not just on the fields of battle, but crucially, in the hearts and minds of the public, both at home and abroad. Making Napoleon physically small in their portrayals made him seem less threatening, more ridiculous, easier to mock, and ultimately, less of a superhuman figure. And by any measure it worked, brilliantly, if unfortunately for historical accuracy.